Alabama is set to carry out an execution that has drawn international criticism.
In the controversy, convicted killer Kenneth Smith requested to die by having pure nitrogen pumped into his lungs. But this type of execution has never been attempted in the world. Fox News' Brendan Kirby now joining us live from Atmore with the latest on this story.
And Brendan, we can expect this to happen soon.
That's right, Lenise and Byron. The state's plan is to start Kenneth Smith's execution at 6 p.m., although the execution window will remain open until 6 in the morning if necessary. Smith is on death row for the 1988 murder for hire of a woman in Colbert County in North Alabama in 1988, as I said. He survived an execution attempt by lethal injection in 2022, so the state plans to use this method called nitrogen hypoxia. A mask will be placed over Smith's face, and the oxygen he breathes will be replaced with nitrogen. State officials say that it will be painless and that he'll be unconscious within seconds. Opponents of this say that it amounts to torture. Brian Stevenson, founder of the Montgomery-based Equal Justice Initiative, referenced that botched execution attempt 14 months ago.
After spending 36 years behind bars, including nearly 28 years on death row, Kenneth Eugene Smith was executed by nitrogen hypoxia on the evening of January 25, 2024. He became the first person in human history killed by this method, not just in America, in the entire world. No government had ever pumped pure nitrogen into a person's lungs and watched them die, until Alabama decided Kenneth Smith would be their test subject. His final meal, a T-bone steak, hash browns, scrambled eggs with A1 sauce, and toast. His final act, signing "I love you" to his family through the death chamber glass, a mask already strapped to his face. And his final words, muffled but defiant: "Tonight Alabama caused humanity to take a step backward. I'm leaving with love, peace, and light." But perhaps the most shocking part was not the execution itself. It was that this was the second time Alabama had tried to kill him. 14 months earlier, on November 17, 2022, Kenneth Smith lay strapped to a gurney in that same death chamber, while prison officials stabbed him with needles for over an hour. They jabbed his hands, his arms, his collarbone. They hung him upside down in what he called an inverted crucifixion position. They injected him with unknown substances. They tortured him for 4 hours, searching for veins they could never find. And when the midnight deadline arrived with no IV access established, they unstrapped him from the gurney and sent him back to his cell. He could not walk. He could not lift his arms. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And he became only the second person in 75 years to survive an execution attempt and face another. "I was absolutely alone in a room full of people," Smith later told NPR. "Not one of them tried to help me. I was crying out for help. When Alabama came for him again, they did not bring needles. They brought nitrogen. An untested method, an experimental protocol, a mask and a tank, and the hope that this time they would succeed in killing the man they had already failed to kill once. They succeeded, but not in the way they promised." State officials had assured the courts that Smith would lose consciousness within seconds, that he would drift peacefully into death. That nitrogen hypoxia was quick, painless, and humane. What witnesses saw was something very different. For 4 minutes after the gas began flowing, Kenneth Smith convulsed violently. His body thrashed against the restraints. His head jerked back and forth. He heaved and retched inside the mask. Spit and mucus pooled on the faceplate. His wife sobbed in the witness area. A corrections officer appeared to be tap dancing with nervous energy. Journalists who had witnessed dozens of executions said they had never seen anything like it. He was pronounced dead at 8:25 p.m., 22 minutes after the nitrogen began to flow. His spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, who stood 3 feet away watching his friend die, called it the most horrible thing I've ever seen, and 22 minutes of horror. The United Nations called it torture. Human rights organizations condemned it as state-sanctioned cruelty. Alabama called it a textbook execution and offered to help other states do the same. But to understand how Kenneth Smith ended up on that gurney, convicted of murder for hire, sentenced to die by a judge who overruled a jury's vote for life, we have to go back to the very beginning. To a Friday evening in March 1988. to a house on Coondog Cemetery Road in rural Alabama, and to a woman named Elizabeth Sennett, who made the fatal mistake of trusting her husband. Elizabeth was 45 years old, a preacher's wife, a mother of 2 grown sons, a grandmother. She was kind and nurturing, the sort of woman who never met a stranger. On the evening of March 18, 1988, 2 young men knocked on her door claiming to be hunters who had permission from her husband to survey the property. She called Charles to verify. He told her to let them in. She did not know her husband had paid those men $1,000 each to kill her. She did not know he had drawn them a diagram of the house, told them she would be home alone, assured them no one would interrupt. She did not know about his affair with a woman from his congregation, his mounting debts, or the $100,000 life insurance policy he had taken out on her life. She trusted the man she had been married to for 26 years. That trust killed her. Within minutes, Kenneth Smith and John Forrest Parker beat Elizabeth with fireplace tools, a walking cane, and a galvanized pipe. They stabbed her 8 times in the chest and twice in the neck. She fought for her life. She lost. 1 week later, her husband Charles Sennett shot himself when police closed in. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. Kenneth Eugene Smith came into the world on July 4, 1965, Independence Day, in Florence, Alabama. The timing of his birth seemed almost ironic, given how his life would unfold. Florence sits in the northwest corner of Alabama, perched along the banks of the Tennessee River. It is the largest city in a region known as the Shoals, a cluster of 4 communities that includes Muscle Shoals, Sheffield, and Tuscumbia. These towns share a common history rooted in cotton, the music industry, and generations of economic struggle. His parents were Gene and Linda Smith. The family lived in the Florence area, part of a community that had seen prosperity come and go over the decades. The Shoals had once dreamed of becoming the Detroit of the South, with nitrate plants built during World War I promising industrial growth. But those dreams faded, and by the time Kenneth was born, the region had settled into a pattern familiar across rural Alabama: modest employment, limited opportunities, and families doing whatever they could to get by. The roots of this poverty ran deep, stretching back through decades of economic policies that favored low wages and minimal investment in education and infrastructure. For families like the Smiths, this meant a constant struggle to provide even basic necessities. Kenneth's childhood was marked by neglect and deprivation. The consequences of this upbringing manifested early. Kenneth was not a strong student. The challenges he faced at home did not disappear when he walked through the schoolhouse doors. By the time he reached 9th grade, around 1980, he had dropped out entirely. He was 15 years old, with no diploma, no vocational training, and few prospects in a region that offered little to young men without credentials. In Florence, dropping out of school meant one thing: manual labor. Kenneth found work as a laborer and mechanic, jobs that paid by the hour and offered no security. He was good with his hands, capable of fixing engines and doing physical work that required more effort than skill. It was honest employment, but the wages were barely enough to survive on. A young man in his position could work exhausting hours and still struggle to cover rent and food. Despite these obstacles, Kenneth tried to build a normal life. During his high school years, before he dropped out, he had met a girl who would become his first wife. They were high school sweethearts in the classic sense, 2 young people finding connection amid the limitations of small-town Alabama. They married young, as was common in the Shoals, and together they had 4 children. But marriage and fatherhood did not change Kenneth's economic reality. The pressures of supporting a wife and 4 children on a laborer's wages proved overwhelming. The relationship fractured under the strain, and by his early 20s, Kenneth was no longer with his first wife. His children grew up largely without him, a situation that would only become more permanent after 1988. Kenneth drifted into a relationship with a woman named Renea Bryant. They never legally married, but they lived together as common-law husband and wife at 306 North Royal Avenue in Florence. By 1988, Kenneth was 22 years old. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed about 170 pounds. He had no significant criminal record, nothing that suggested he was capable of violence. He was just another young man in the Shoals, scraping by on whatever work he could find, trying to support a household that seemed perpetually short on money. It was in this state of financial desperation that Kenneth Smith first encountered a man named Billy Gray Williams. Williams lived in a small apartment at the corner of Tuscaloosa and Cypress Streets in Florence, and he had a proposition. Someone needed a job done, he said. The pay was good. All Kenneth had to do was help with one thing. What Williams was offering was not a construction job or a mechanic's position. It was something far darker, and it would set Kenneth Smith on a path that would end 36 years later. To understand how Kenneth came to accept such an offer, we must first understand the man who made it. Billy Gray Williams was 21 years old in 1988, just a year younger than Kenneth Smith. He lived in a small apartment in Florence and drove a red and white Thunderbird that stood out on the modest streets of the Shoals. To the people who knew him, he seemed like just another young man trying to get by in a town with limited opportunities. But Williams had connections that set him apart from most of his neighbors. One of those connections was a man named Charles Sennett Sr. Sennett was a preacher, the pastor of Westside Church of Christ in Sheffield, one of the 4 cities that make up the Shoals. He was also Williams's landlord. Williams rented a small space from Sennett at the corner of Tuscaloosa and Cypress Streets, and over time, the two had developed an unusual relationship. Sometime in early 1988, Sennett approached Williams with a request. He needed someone killed, he said. His wife, Elizabeth. Sennett was willing to pay $3,000 for the job. It was a staggering sum for that time and place, more money than most people in Florence saw in months of work. Williams did not have the stomach to do the killing himself, but he knew people who might. He thought of Kenneth Smith, a young man he had met around town. Smith was broke, always looking for ways to make money. Williams also knew another man, John Forrest Parker, who had his own reasons for needing cash. Williams approached both men with the offer. The job would pay $1,000 each. All they had to do was go to the Sennett home in the rural outskirts of Colbert County and make sure Elizabeth Sennett did not survive the encounter. Williams would keep the remaining $1,000 for himself as a finder's fee. The plan began to take shape about a month before the murder. Williams introduced Smith and Parker to Charles Sennett, and the 4 men met several times to discuss the details. One of these meetings took place in Sennett's truck, parked outside Williams's apartment. Another happened at a coffee house called ECM, where Sennett drew a diagram of his house, showing where the rooms were located and where his wife would likely be. Sennett was specific about how he wanted the murder to look. It needed to appear like a burglary gone wrong, he said. Smith and Parker should take a few items from the house to make it seem like robbery was the motive. This would deflect suspicion away from Sennett himself. On the Thursday before the murder, Sennett met with the men again. He gave them $200 to buy supplies, whatever they might need for the job. He also showed them the rest of the money, proving that the full payment would be waiting for them once Elizabeth was dead. John Forrest Parker used his $100 share of the advance money to buy drugs. Specifically, he purchased 3 cubic centimeters of Talwin, an opioid painkiller that was popular on the streets at the time. Kenneth Smith's use of his portion was not recorded in court documents. The date was set for March 18, 1988, a Friday. Charles Sennett would make sure he was away from the house that evening, establishing an alibi. Smith and Parker would arrive, do what needed to be done, and collect their payment. But who was John Forrest Parker, the man who would accompany Kenneth Smith that night? And what kind of man was Charles Sennett? A preacher who could calmly arrange the murder of his own wife. To understand the full horror of what happened on that March evening, we need to know more about the people involved. John Forrest Parker came from the same world as Kenneth Smith. He was a young man in the Shoals with no money, no prospects, and a growing dependency on drugs. By 1988, Parker's need for Talwin and other substances had become the driving force in his life, the engine that powered every decision he made. Little is known about Parker's early years. He was born and raised in Florence, part of the same community that produced Kenneth Smith and Billy Gray Williams. He was not a hardened criminal with a long rap sheet. Like Smith, he had no history of violent crime before March 1988. He was simply a young man who had fallen into addiction and was willing to do desperate things to feed that addiction. The depth of Parker's drug problem became evident in what he did with the money Billy Gray Williams gave him. Williams had provided Parker with $100 specifically to purchase a weapon for the murder. The plan called for a gun, something that would make the killing quick and efficient. But Parker never bought a weapon. Instead, he used that $100 to purchase 3 cubic centimeters of Talwin. He shot up the drugs rather than preparing for the crime he had agreed to commit. This decision would have consequences. Without a gun, Parker and Smith would have to improvise on the night of the murder. When Billy Gray Williams approached Parker with the offer to kill Elizabeth Sennett, the payment must have seemed like a lifeline. $1,000 was enough to keep him supplied with drugs for months. The moral weight of what he was being asked to do apparently did not register with the same urgency as his need for the next fix. Charles Sennett Sr. was born on October 23, 1942. He built a life that appeared respectable from the outside. He was the pastor of Westside Church of Christ in Sheffield, Alabama, a position of trust and authority in the close-knit religious community of the Shoals. He had a wife of 26 years and 2 grown sons. He owned property, including rental units that provided additional income. To his congregation, he was a man of God, someone they trusted with their spiritual lives and their personal confidences. But Charles Sennett was many things to many people, and few of those things were true. The deceptions began early. When he first met Elizabeth Thorne, the young woman from Cleveland, Ohio, who would become his wife, Charles reportedly portrayed himself as a grieving widower. Whether this was true or simply the first of many lies is unclear from the historical record. There is no documented evidence of a first wife, no death certificate, no grave. What is clear is that from the very beginning of their relationship, Charles Sennett was a man who shaped reality to suit his needs, who told people what they wanted to hear, and who constructed whatever version of himself would get him what he wanted. Elizabeth believed him. She was 20 years old, in 1962, young and trusting, when she married this man who claimed to have already lost one wife. She moved from Cleveland to rural Alabama, leaving behind the industrial city of her childhood for the small towns of the Shoals. She committed herself to building a life with Charles, to supporting his ministry, to raising the family they would create together. Together they had 2 sons. Charles Jr., called Chuck, came first. Then Michael, called Mike. The boys grew up in the shadow of their father's pulpit, attending church every Sunday, learning the rhythms of a preacher's household. Their mother held everything together at home while their father tended to his congregation. It appeared from the outside to be a stable Christian family. Elizabeth devoted herself to the role of preacher's wife. She attended services faithfully. She participated in church activities. She kept their home on Coondog Cemetery Road in rural Colbert County, a house set back from the road where visitors were rare and neighbors were not within earshot. She raised her sons to know right from wrong. She supported her husband through his struggles, including a nervous breakdown that nearly ended his ministry. To Elizabeth, Charles was her husband of more than 2 decades, the father of her children, a man of God. She had no reason to suspect that he was living a double life, that he was spending money they did not have, that he was involved with another woman, that he was planning her death. To the Sheffield congregation where he served as pulpit minister, Charles appeared to be a devoted servant of God who loved Scripture and cared deeply for his flock. He preached on Sundays with apparent conviction. He counseled members during the week, offering spiritual guidance and a sympathetic ear. The congregation trusted him with their struggles, their confessions, their vulnerabilities. To those who knew him away from Colbert County, Charles Sennett was a different man entirely. He was a sometime high roller who spent money, living beyond his means while debts accumulated. He cultivated an image of prosperity that had no foundation in reality. The rental properties, the lifestyle, the appearance of success, all of it was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. And then there was Doris Tidwell. Doris was a member of the West Side Church of Christ congregation, one of the faithful who came to hear Charles preach each Sunday. She trusted her minister as congregants do. She had no idea that Charles Sennett had singled her out for manipulation. At some point, the relationship between pastor and congregant crossed a line. Charles began an affair with Doris, betraying both his wife and his calling. He used his position of spiritual authority to draw her in, presenting himself as a man in need of understanding and comfort. To Doris, Charles told a very different story about his marriage than the reality Elizabeth was living. He painted himself as a victim, trapped in an unhappy union with a profligate wife who wasted his money and made his life miserable. He told Doris that Elizabeth spent recklessly, that she was the source of his financial problems, that he deserved better than the life he was stuck in. He presented Elizabeth, the quiet homemaker who had devoted her life to supporting him, as the villain in his story. It was all lies. Elizabeth was not profligate. She did not waste money. She did not hold a job outside the home. She lived modestly, raising their children, keeping their house, playing the role of dutiful preacher's wife. The debts that Charles blamed on Elizabeth were his own creation, the result of his spending, his gambling tendencies, his need to project an image of success he could not afford. Doris Tidwell did not know she was being manipulated by a man who had spent his entire adult life deceiving the people closest to him. She saw a minister in distress, a man who seemed to need help through no fault of his own. She believed his stories about Elizabeth. She believed he loved her. She believed she was helping him. When Charles needed $3,000 to pay for his wife's murder, he turned to Doris. He did not tell her what the money was really for. Instead, he fabricated a story. Some accounts suggest he claimed it was to repay a loan or cover a legitimate expense, and Doris gave him the money without question. She trusted her minister. She trusted the man she believed loved her. Doris Tidwell had no idea that she was financing a murder. She had no idea that the $3,000 she gave Charles would be divided among the men who would beat and stab Elizabeth Sennett to death. She was an unwitting accomplice, manipulated by a man who used everyone around him as tools for his own purposes. The depth of Charles Sennett's betrayal is difficult to fully comprehend. He manipulated his mistress into paying for the murder of his wife. He used faith, love, and trust as weapons, turning them against the women who believed in him. He lied to his congregation, his family, his mistress, and his wife. Different lies to different people, all serving his own interests. Behind the facade of respectability, Charles Sennett was a man in crisis of his own making. His finances had spiraled out of control. The details of his debts were never fully disclosed during the trials that followed, but they were significant enough that he saw no way out except through his wife's death. He had created the problem through his own spending and deception, and now he planned to solve it by eliminating the woman he had sworn to love and protect. The life insurance policy on Elizabeth was worth $100,000. In 1988, that was a substantial sum, equivalent to several $100,000 today when adjusted for inflation. It would have been enough to clear Sennett's debts and give him a fresh start. All it required was Elizabeth's death and a murder that looked like something else entirely. Sennett also had another motivation beyond the money. He was deeply involved in an extramarital affair with Doris Tidwell, a member of his own congregation. The affair had apparently been going on for some time, and Sennett had reached a point where he wanted out of his marriage entirely. But divorce was not an acceptable option in his denomination. The Church of Christ took a strict view of marital dissolution, and a divorced minister would likely lose his pulpit and his standing in the community. Murder, apparently, seemed preferable to divorce. There was also the matter of Sennett's mental health. He had a documented history of psychiatric problems. When his sons were younger, he had suffered what was described as a nervous breakdown. He had been prescribed lithium, a medication commonly used to treat bipolar disorder. The lithium helped stabilize him, and despite some who said he might not be able to preach again, he continued in his ministry. But 1 to 2 months before Elizabeth's death, Sennett had stopped taking his medication. His son Chuck would later reflect on this decision with bitter hindsight. From what I understand, he had taken himself off that drug about a month or 2 before that happened, Chuck said, and that's when everything went to pot. Whether his untreated mental illness contributed to his decision to have his wife killed cannot be known for certain. What is clear is that by early 1988, Charles Sennett had decided that Elizabeth needed to die, and he had found men willing to do it for $3,000. In the morning of March 18th, Smith and Parker prepared for the job. They drove toward the Sennett residence in Parker's vehicle, Smith sitting in the passenger seat. As Parker drove, Smith sharpened the 6-inch survival knife they would use if things got close. Parker had been given money to buy a gun, but he had spent it on drugs instead. They would have to improvise. The Sennett home sat on Coondog Cemetery Road in a rural part of Colbert County, surrounded by wooded land that would have been suitable for hunting. This was the cover story they planned to use. They were hunters looking for a place to pursue game, and Charles Sennett had given them permission to survey the property. Smith and Parker arrived at the house that afternoon. Elizabeth was home alone, going about her daily routine in the house where she had lived for years. She had no reason to expect danger. This was her home, her sanctuary, the place where she had raised her children and built her life. The 2 men knocked on the door. When Elizabeth answered, they told her they were friends of her husband who were interested in hunting in the area. Charles had said they could look around the property, they explained. Could they walk the grounds and see if it would be suitable? Elizabeth was cautious. She did not know these men. They were strangers, young men she had never seen before, and her husband had not mentioned anything about hunters coming by. Before agreeing to let them explore the property, she picked up the phone and called Charles. "Do you know these men?" she asked. "They say you told them they could hunt here. Can I let them look around?" Her husband's voice came through the receiver, calm and reassuring. Yes, he knew them. Yes, they had his permission. Let them look around. It was fine. With that confirmation from the man she had trusted for 26 years, Elizabeth allowed Smith and Parker to walk the grounds behind the house. The 2 men disappeared into the wooded area behind the property, ostensibly surveying the land for hunting potential. They walked around for a while, then left the property entirely. One account suggests they drove down the road and parked somewhere, perhaps working up their nerve for what they had agreed to do. After some time, they returned to the Sennett home. Smith and Parker knocked on the door again. This time, they had a different request. They asked Elizabeth if they could come inside to use the bathroom and get some water. It was a reasonable ask, the kind of small courtesy anyone might extend to visitors who had been walking around on a warm Alabama afternoon. Elizabeth saw no reason to refuse. Her husband knew these men. They were polite. She opened the door and let them into her home. The 2 men entered the house with murder on their minds. Parker asked to use the bathroom, and Elizabeth directed him to it. While Parker was out of the room, Smith remained with Elizabeth in the main living area. He made small talk, keeping her attention focused on him. Elizabeth had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. She was simply being hospitable to men her husband had vouched for, waiting for one of them to finish in the bathroom so they could be on their way. What Elizabeth did not realize was that Smith was positioning her. He kept the conversation going, kept her facing him, kept her attention occupied. Behind her, the bathroom door opened. Parker emerged and began moving toward Elizabeth from the rear, staying in her blind spot. Then Parker struck. He blindsided Elizabeth from behind, hitting her before she had any chance to see the blow coming or defend herself. The impact knocked her down, and in that instant, everything changed. The friendly visitors revealed themselves as killers. The hospitable afternoon became a fight for survival. Smith joined the attack immediately. Both men fell upon Elizabeth, and a brutal beating ensued. Both men fell on Elizabeth, using whatever was within reach as weapons. The evidence would later show that every piece of a fireplace set was used in the beating. A walking cane became a weapon. A piece of galvanized pipe was swung at her body. Elizabeth, a small woman of 5 feet 4 inches, fought back against 2 young men in their 20s. She struggled for her life, refusing to simply submit to her attackers. Sheriff Ronnie May would later say that Elizabeth fought it, and she fought hard. The crime scene bore evidence of her resistance, blood spatter patterns that showed movement, defensive injuries that indicated she had tried to shield herself, signs of a struggle throughout the area where she was attacked. But the fight was hopelessly uneven. She had no weapons, no means of escape, and no one coming to help her. The house was isolated, set back from the road on rural property where neighbors were not within earshot. Her screams, if she managed to scream, would have gone unheard. At some point during the attack, the beating escalated to stabbing. Parker's survival knife, the one Smith had sharpened during the drive over, was plunged into Elizabeth's body. The medical examiner would later document 8 stab wounds to her chest and 1 on each side of her neck. Any one of these wounds could have been fatal. The beating and stabbing left Elizabeth Sennett dying on the floor of her own home, surrounded by her own blood, her body broken by the violence inflicted upon it. The 2 men, their work done, stepped back and surveyed what they had accomplished. A woman was dead. They had earned their $1,000 each. Now they had to make it look like a burglary. Smith and Parker moved through the house, taking items that would support the cover story. They grabbed a VCR, a Samsung model that would later be found at Smith's home. They took a stereo system. These were the kinds of things burglars would steal, portable electronics that could be sold or pawned. The staging was amateurish, the work of men who had never committed a crime of this magnitude before. To experienced investigators, the scene would not quite add up. The brutality of the attack seemed excessive for a simple robbery. The choice of items taken seemed almost random. Something about the whole picture was wrong. But Smith and Parker did not know that. They took their stolen goods, left Elizabeth bleeding on the floor, and departed the scene. Elizabeth was still alive when they walked out the door. At some point, after their departure, emergency medical technicians arrived at the Sennett home. When the emergency unit reached Elizabeth, they found something unexpected, a faint pulse. Despite the horrific injuries she had sustained, the multiple stab wounds, the savage beating, Elizabeth Sennett was not yet dead. Sheriff Ronnie May was one of the first law enforcement officers on the scene. When he arrived, he could not find a pulse on Elizabeth, but the EMTs, with their training and equipment, detected the faint sign of life that May had missed. She was clinging to existence by the thinnest of threads. May rode in the ambulance with Elizabeth as she was rushed to Helen Keller Hospital in Sheffield. The hospital was named after the famous deaf-blind author who had been born in nearby Tuscumbia, and it served as the primary medical facility for the Shoals region. The medical team there would do everything they could for Elizabeth Sennett, but the damage was too severe. The combination of blunt force trauma from the beating and the multiple stab wounds had destroyed her body beyond any possibility of recovery. Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett was pronounced dead at Helen Keller Hospital, her fight finally over. She was 45 years old. She had been married for 26 years. She had 2 sons and at least 1 grandchild. She had been killed in her own home by strangers, on the orders of her own husband, for $1,000 each. An interesting detail emerged later. When Charles Sennett was informed that his wife had been found with a faint pulse, Sheriff May noticed that Sennett almost fell. The reaction suggested that Charles had expected Elizabeth to be found dead, not dying. The possibility that she might survive, might be able to identify her attackers or reveal something about the crime, clearly shook him. His careful plan depended on Elizabeth being dead, and for a moment it seemed like she might not be. But Elizabeth never regained consciousness. She could not identify the men who had attacked her or reveal that they had claimed to know her husband. Whatever she might have been able to tell investigators died with her at Helen Keller Hospital. The investigation into her death would begin immediately. The Colbert County Sheriff's Office caught the case. Captain Ronnie May was assigned as the lead investigator. Working alongside him was Harold Carson, an investigator from the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. Together, they began the process of piecing together what had happened to Elizabeth Sennett. The crime scene told a story of extreme violence. Blood evidence throughout the house documented the brutality of the attack. The staging of the scene as a burglary was amateurish, the work of men who had never committed a crime of this magnitude before. To experienced investigators, something about the scene did not add up. The investigation might have taken months if not for a break that came through Crime Stoppers. An anonymous female caller, identified in the records only by a tip number, contacted the tip line with information that would crack the case wide open. The caller provided 3 names: Kenneth Smith, John Forrest Parker, and Billy Gray Williams. She gave their addresses. She described their vehicles. Most importantly, she told investigators that Kenneth Smith had the VCR taken from the Sennett home and that John Forrest Parker had the knife used in the murder. This kind of detailed information could only have come from someone close to the conspirators. The identity of the tipster was never revealed, as Crime Stoppers guarantees anonymity to its callers. But her information gave investigators everything they needed to move forward. On March 31, 1988, less than 2 weeks after Elizabeth's murder, investigators executed a search warrant at Kenneth Smith's home. They found what they were looking for: a Samsung VCR, model VT311TQ, serial number 702013224. It was the same VCR that had been taken from the Sennett residence. With the physical evidence in hand, investigators moved to arrest all 3 men. Smith, Parker, and Williams were taken into custody approximately 1 month after the murder. The speed of the arrests was remarkable for a case of this complexity, and it was due almost entirely to the Crime Stoppers' tip. Once in custody, the conspirators began to talk. Kenneth Smith gave a detailed confession that laid out the entire plot. He described being contacted by Williams about a month before the murder. He told investigators about meeting Charles Sennett in Sennett's truck outside Williams's apartment. Smith described the meeting at the ECM Coffee House, where Sennett drew a diagram of his house. He recounted receiving $200 for supplies on the Thursday before the murder. He explained how Sennett wanted the killing to look like a burglary gone bad. The confession was damning. It established premeditation, financial motive, and the roles of each conspirator. But by the time Smith was confessing, one of the conspirators was already beyond the reach of justice. Charles Sennett Sr. had killed himself on March 25, 1988, exactly 1 week after his wife's murder. The circumstances of his death revealed the cowardice that had defined his entire scheme. On that day, investigators brought Charles in for questioning at the Colbert County Sheriff's Department. They had already received the Crime Stoppers' tip naming Smith, Parker, and Williams. They knew Charles was connected to Billy Gray Williams through the rental property. They suspected the grieving widower was not what he appeared to be. During the interview, Charles maintained his innocence. He played the part of the shocked husband, denying any involvement in his wife's death. He was calm, controlled, projecting the same facade of respectability he had worn for years. Then someone asked if he knew Kenneth Smith. Charles Sennett turned red, his composure shattered. The mention of Smith's name hit him like a physical blow, and everyone in the room could see it. The carefully constructed mask slipped, and beneath it was the face of a guilty man. Charles ended the interview abruptly and left the sheriff's department. But he did not go home. Instead, he drove to his church, West Side Church of Christ, the place where he had preached for years, where he had built his reputation as a man of God. He called his sons to meet him there. Chuck and Mike arrived at the church not knowing what their father wanted to tell them. They had just buried their mother. They were still processing the horror of her death, still trying to understand how a burglary could have turned so violent. What happened next would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Charles gathered his sons and other family members in the church. Standing in the building where he had delivered countless sermons about sin and redemption, he began to confess. He told them about the affair with Doris Tidwell, the congregant he had been seeing behind Elizabeth's back. He told them about the financial problems, the debts he had accumulated, the insurance policy on their mother. Then he told them the worst of it. He admitted that he had planned their mother's murder. He revealed that he had hired men to kill her, that he had drawn them a map of the house, that he had told Elizabeth to let them in when she called to verify their story. He confessed to orchestrating the death of the woman they had all loved. Chuck and Mike stood there, listening to their father destroy everything they thought they knew about their family. Their mother was dead because their father had paid to have her killed. The man who had raised them, who had preached to them about morality and faith, was a murderer. After the confession, the group moved outside to the church parking lot. Charles asked Mike to move his car closer to the house. At the time, the request seemed strange, meaningless, just another odd detail in an afternoon that had already shattered their world. Mike did as his father asked, without understanding why. Only later would Mike realize what his father was doing. Charles was clearing the driveway so an ambulance could get through. He had already decided what he was going to do next. He was simply arranging the logistics of his own death. Moments after Mike moved his car, Charles Sennett walked to his truck in the parking lot. He climbed inside, closed the door, and shot himself in the chest. He was 45 years old, the same age as the wife he had ordered killed. His sons found him in the truck, dead by his own hand, 1 week after their mother had been beaten and stabbed to death in their family home. In the span of 7 days, Chuck and Mike Sennett lost both parents, one to murder, one to suicide, and learned that their father had been responsible for their mother's death. The prosecution would have to proceed with the 3 surviving defendants. Billy Gray Williams, who had recruited the killers, would face trial. John Forrest Parker, who had struck the first blow, would face trial, and Kenneth Eugene Smith, who had participated in the beating and stabbing, would face trial. But Smith's path through the justice system would prove to be the most complicated and contentious of all. Kenneth Smith's first trial took place in 1989. The case had attracted significant attention in Colbert County, making it difficult to seat an impartial jury. The court granted a change of venue, moving the trial to Jefferson County, which includes Birmingham, the largest city in Alabama. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They had Smith's own confession, they had the VCR recovered from his home, they had testimony from the other conspirators, and they had the brutal facts of Elizabeth Sennett's death. The beating, the stabbing, the staging of a fake burglary. The defense argued that Smith had been recruited by others, that he was young and poor, that he had no prior history of violence. They pointed to his difficult upbringing, his lack of education, his desperation for money. None of it excused what he had done, but the defense hoped it might persuade the jury to spare his life. The jury was not persuaded to acquit. On November 3, 1989, they returned a guilty verdict after less than 2 hours of deliberation. The speed of the verdict suggested that the jury had little doubt about Smith's role in the murder. Then came the penalty phase. Under Alabama law at the time, the jury would recommend either life in prison without parole or the death penalty. The judge would then make the final decision, and the judge was not required to follow the jury's recommendation. The jury voted 10-2 in favor of death. This was a strong recommendation, but not unanimous. 2 jurors had been convinced that life in prison was the appropriate punishment. The judge considered their verdict and agreed with the majority. Kenneth Smith was sentenced to death. Smith's attorneys immediately began the appeals process. They raised multiple issues, but one would prove decisive. During jury selection, the prosecution had used its peremptory challenges to strike black jurors from the panel. The defense argued this was racial discrimination, a violation of the Supreme Court's ruling in Batson v. Kentucky. The appellate courts agreed. In 1992, Smith's conviction and death sentence were overturned. The court found that the prosecution had indeed struck jurors based on their race, not for any legitimate reason. This meant the entire trial was tainted, and Smith was entitled to a new one. For the Sennett family, this was a devastating setback. 4 years after Elizabeth's murder, they would have to sit through another trial, relive the horror of her death again, and hope that this time the verdict would stick. Kenneth Smith's second trial took place in 1996. 7 years had passed since his first conviction, 8 years since Elizabeth Sennett's murder. The case returned to court with new attorneys, a new jury, and a judge named M. Pride Tompkins presiding. The facts of the case had not changed. Smith had confessed. The physical evidence remained. The testimony of the other conspirators was still available. The prosecution presented essentially the same case they had in 1989, and the outcome of the guilt phase was the same. Kenneth Smith was convicted of capital murder. But the penalty phase would take an unexpected turn. The composition of the jury was notably different from the first trial. This time, the panel consisted of 7 black women, 4 black men, and 1 white woman. The defense had succeeded in seating a more diverse jury, one that might be less inclined to impose the death penalty. The jury listened to the evidence presented during the penalty phase. They heard about the brutality of the murder, the premeditation involved, the fact that Smith had killed for money. But they also heard mitigating evidence: his young age at the time of the crime, his lack of criminal history, his good behavior in prison, an emotional testimony from his family. Smith's mother took the stand and pleaded for her son's life. Her testimony was described as an emotional appeal, one that clearly moved some members of the jury. When the jury retired to deliberate on the sentence, they faced a difficult decision. They voted 11-1 for life in prison without parole. Only 1 juror wanted the death penalty. The other 11 believed that while Smith deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars, he did not deserve to die for what he had done. In most states, that would have been the end of it. An 11-1 vote for life would have meant a sentence of life without parole. But Alabama was not most states. Alabama was one of only 3 states in the country that allowed judges to override jury sentencing recommendations in capital cases. The other 2 were Delaware and Florida. Judge M. Pride Tompkins exercised that power. In May 1996, she overrode the jury's recommendation and sentenced Kenneth Smith to death. Her written ruling explained her reasoning. The murder was committed for hire, she wrote. Smith had ample opportunity to reflect on what he was doing and withdraw from the plan. He had chosen to proceed. The judge discounted the jury's verdict, suggesting they had been unduly swayed by the emotional appeal from Smith's mother. She acknowledged the mitigating factors the defense had presented: his age, his lack of criminal history, his good prison record, his difficult childhood. But she gave these factors little weight. In a later interview, Judge Tompkins defended her decision. She said Smith deserved the death penalty. She also said that some people on juries simply do not want the responsibility of sentencing someone to death, implying that the jury had shirked their duty. After his second trial and sentencing in 1996, Kenneth Smith entered the death row unit at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. He would spend the next 26 years there, waiting as his attorneys filed appeal after appeal, exhausting every legal avenue available to save his life. Death row at Holman was a world unto itself. The facility, opened in 1969, housed Alabama's male death row inmates in a segregated unit away from the general prison population. Conditions were harsh. Inmates spent most of their time in small cells, with limited opportunities for recreation or human contact. But Smith did not waste his years on death row. Unlike many inmates who spiral into depression or anger, he used the time to transform himself. He taught himself to read more deeply, becoming an avid consumer of books on philosophy, spirituality, and self-improvement. He took up meditation, finding some measure of peace in a place designed to offer none. He also became a teacher. Smith helped other inmates learn to read and write, sharing whatever knowledge he had acquired. He took up chess, developing his skills to the point where he could compete with serious players. He began drawing and writing, expressing himself through art in ways he never had as a young man. His prison record was notable for its lack of violence. Over more than 3 decades of incarceration, Smith had no significant disciplinary problems. He followed the rules, avoided confrontations, and earned a reputation as a model prisoner. This was the mitigating evidence that Judge Tompkins had given little weight. During his time on death row, Smith married again. Deanna became his wife and his primary connection to the outside world. She visited him regularly, corresponded with him constantly, and became his advocate as his case wound through the courts. The appeals process dragged on for years. Smith's direct appeal was affirmed in 2000, meaning the Alabama courts found no reversible error in his trial. He then pursued federal habeas corpus relief, challenging his conviction and sentence on constitutional grounds. That process took more years. On February 22, 2022, the United States Supreme Court denied certiorari in Smith's case. This meant the highest court in the land would not review his claims. His legal options were running out. For 34 years, the appeals process had kept him alive. Now the state of Alabama was preparing to carry out his sentence. If you're finding this documentary informative, please consider subscribing to No Way Out and hitting the notification bell. Your support helps us continue producing in-depth true crime content that examines these complex cases with the depth they deserve. While Smith was on death row, the other conspirators met their fates. John Forrest Parker was executed by lethal injection on June 10, 2010. Billy Gray Williams died in prison in November 2020. Charles Sennett Sr. had been dead since 1988. Of the 4 men involved in Elizabeth Sennett's murder, only Kenneth Smith remained alive. Alabama scheduled his execution for November 17, 2022. The method would be lethal injection. November 17, 2022 was supposed to be the day Kenneth Smith died. Alabama had scheduled his execution by lethal injection. The drugs were ready, the witnesses were assembled, the death warrant had been signed, everything was in place to carry out the sentence imposed 26 years earlier. But this execution would be the 3rd consecutive botched procedure in Alabama. The state's corrections department had developed a troubling pattern of failures, and Kenneth Smith would become the most dramatic example yet of their incompetence. The problems began before the execution team even attempted to carry out their task. At 7:45 in the evening, the Alabama Department of Corrections emailed Smith's attorneys to inform them they were preparing for the execution. This was despite the fact that a motion was still pending before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. At 7:57 p.m., guards ended Smith's phone call with his wife Deanna. It was the last time he would hear her voice that night, the last time he would speak to anyone who cared about him. They immediately handcuffed and shackled him for transport to the execution chamber. 2 minutes later, at 7:59 p.m., the 11th Circuit Court issued a stay of execution. Smith's lawyers received the stay order and immediately notified the Alabama Department of Corrections at 8:02 p.m. The response they received was chilling in its brevity. Noted. The state did not inform Smith of the stay. They did not release him from the gurney. They did not allow him to contact his lawyers or his family. Instead, they strapped him to the execution gurney at approximately 8 p.m. and kept him there, restrained and immobilized, for nearly 4 hours. He had no way of knowing that a federal court had temporarily halted his execution. As far as Kenneth Smith knew, he was about to die. Meanwhile, the state appealed to the Supreme Court to lift the stay. For over hours, Smith lay on the gurney in the execution chamber, strapped down, unable to move, waiting. The chamber was cold and sterile. The lights were bright. He was surrounded by people whose job was to kill him, and he believed they were about to do exactly that. The psychological torture of those hours would stay with him long after the physical wounds healed. At approximately 10:20 p.m., the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of Alabama, lifting the stay. The execution could proceed. But by this point, precious time had been lost. Under Alabama's own protocols, executions were supposed to be completed by midnight. The death warrant would expire at that hour, and if the execution was not finished, it would have to be called off. The clock was ticking. The execution team had 100 minutes to establish IV access and inject the lethal drugs. The team began attempting to establish intravenous access. This should have been a routine procedure, one performed thousands of times daily in hospitals and clinics across the country. A competent medical professional can typically establish IV access in 2.5 to 16 minutes. Difficult cases might require 30 minutes. The team at Holman Correctional Facility would have nearly 2 hours. They could not find a suitable vein. For approximately 1 hour, they jabbed needles into Smith's hands and arms, multiple punctures in the same locations. Over and over, they slid needles into his flesh, probing for veins that they could not access. Smith later described the experience to NPR. They were just sticking me over and over, going in the same hole like a freaking sewing machine, he said. The image was vivid and horrifying. The repeated penetration of the same puncture wound, the needle sliding in and out of damaged tissue, the accumulating pain with each attempt. At one point, Smith informed an execution team member that they were painfully inserting the needle into his muscle rather than his vein. The pain was excruciating. He told them they were doing it wrong. According to Smith's court filings, the team member responded, "No, I'm not." They continued. Unable to establish standard IV access, the execution team tried a different approach. They adjusted the gurney to place Smith into what he later described as an inverted crucifixion position. Tilted back with his head below his feet, his body suspended at an angle that was supposed to make his veins more accessible. They left him hanging there for several minutes while they regrouped. When they returned, they injected Smith with an unknown substance. His lawyers later believed it to be some sort of sedative or anesthetic. Smith specifically objected to this injection. The state had been ordered by a federal judge not to use intramuscular sedation during his execution, but they injected him anyway, violating the court's order and their own assurances. A deputy warden held Smith's head and torqued it to the side, telling him this was for your own good. The team then attempted to insert a central line through Smith's subclavian vein near his collarbone. This is a more invasive procedure than a standard IV, one typically performed only by experienced medical professionals under controlled conditions. It involves inserting a large-gauge needle deep into the chest to access a major blood vessel. They jabbed him 5 or 6 times with a clear syringe. They poked him multiple times with a large-gauge needle in his collarbone area. Each attempt failed. Each attempt caused more pain. Throughout this process, Smith writhed in agony. He had been on the gurney for hours. His arms and hands were punctured and bruised from the failed IV attempts. His chest and collarbone were being stabbed with large needles. He was tilted at an unnatural angle. He was surrounded by people who were trying to kill him and failing, and the failure was causing him tremendous suffering. At approximately 11:20 p.m., with the midnight deadline approaching and no viable IV access established, the execution was called off. The team had been trying for nearly 2 hours. They had failed to establish the intravenous lines necessary to inject the lethal drugs. Kenneth Smith would not die that night. He was unstrapped from the gurney. He was unable to walk on his own. He could not lift his arms. He could not dress himself without assistance. He was sweating and hyperventilating in shock from the hours of torture he had endured. He still did not know the execution had been stopped. It was not until sometime before midnight that Smith learned he would not die that night. For all that time, strapped to the gurney, being stabbed repeatedly with needles, he believed he was about to be executed. The psychological impact of that experience, the prolonged anticipation of death, the physical pain, the helplessness, the isolation, would stay with him for the rest of his life. In several important respects, what Kenneth Smith experienced that night was effectively a mock execution. Mock executions, putting a prisoner through the psychological trauma of believing they are about to be killed, constitute torture under federal and international law. Smith had been taken to the death chamber, strapped to the gurney and subjected to hours of pain and fear before being returned to his cell. The state had not killed his body, but it had done something to his mind that would never fully heal. Governor Kay Ivey released a statement after the failed execution. Kenneth Eugene Smith chose $1,000 over the life of Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett, and he was guilty, no question about it, she said. Although that justice could not be carried out tonight because of last-minute legal attempts to delay or cancel the execution, attempting it was the right thing to do. The statement made no mention of the hours Smith had spent strapped to the gurney. It made no mention of the repeated needle sticks, the unknown injection, the central line attempts, the physical and psychological damage inflicted on a man the state could not manage to kill. To Governor Ivey, the failed execution was simply the result of last-minute legal attempts to delay. 4 days after the failed execution, on November 21, 2022, Governor Ivey suspended executions in Alabama and ordered what she called a top-to-bottom review of the state's execution process. The review was completed in 3 months. It was conducted internally by the same Alabama Department of Corrections officials responsible for the failed and botched executions. Commissioner John Hamm sent the governor a 2-page letter announcing that, after talking with ADOC staff, he had decided they were as prepared as possible to resume carrying out executions. The letter provided little detail about what changes, if any, had been made to the execution protocol. Unlike Tennessee, which had paused executions to allow for a third-party investigation into operational failures, Alabama's truncated internal review failed to identify any problems with its protocol or explain what went wrong in its last 3 scheduled executions. On January 12, 2023, the Alabama Supreme Court amended state rules governing death warrants. The amendment gave the governor power to set the time frame for executions, effectively eliminating the midnight deadline that had forced the state to call off Smith's execution. In the future, Alabama would have more time to stab and prod and probe its prisoners before the death warrant expired. The review was over. The rules were changed. Alabama was ready to start killing again. For Kenneth Smith, the nightmare was far from over. The psychological trauma of November 17, 2022, had left deep scars. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. He suffered from nightmares, hypervigilance, hyperarousal, and dissociation. He struggled daily with the memories of what had been done to him. "I'm still carrying the trauma from the last time," he told NPR in January 2024, as his second execution date approached. "I'm being treated for PTSD, and I struggle daily. So when I got this date, my level of anxiety this time was not even close to what I faced last time." His lawyers argued that subjecting Smith to a second execution attempt, after the torture he had endured during the first, violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. They argued that waiting to be killed again was itself a form of torture, compounding the trauma already inflicted. The courts disagreed. Every appeal was denied. Kenneth Smith would face the execution chamber again, but this time, the method would be different. As part of a settlement with Smith's legal team, the state agreed not to attempt another lethal injection. Instead, Alabama would use nitrogen hypoxia, a method of execution that had never been used anywhere in the world. Smith had calculated that being suffocated with nitrogen gas would be preferable to enduring another round of needle torture. It was not a choice anyone should have to make. But after what he had been through on November 17, 2022, Smith chose the gas. Legal battles continued up until the final hours. Smith's attorneys argued that using an untested method on their client was unconstitutional experimentation. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, in a dissenting opinion, wrote that Alabama had selected Smith as its guinea pig to test a method of execution never attempted before. "The world is watching," she warned. But the majority of the Supreme Court declined to intervene. On the morning of January 25, 2024, Kenneth Smith woke up knowing this would be his last day on Earth. The nitrogen mask was waiting. Kenneth Smith's last 24 hours followed the grim routine established for condemned prisoners in Alabama. He was allowed 9 visitors. his spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, his mother, his brother, some few others, and his attorney. These were the people who had stood by him through 36 years of incarceration. For breakfast on his final morning, Smith ate 2 biscuits, eggs, grape jelly, applesauce, and orange juice. It was standard prison fare, unremarkable in every way. The condemned man ate what he was given and waited for the day to unfold. His final meal request was more personal. At 10 in the morning, he was served a T-bone steak, hash browns, scrambled eggs with A1 sauce, and toast. It was the kind of meal a man from the Shoals might order at a diner on a special occasion. After the meal, he was restricted to clear liquids only. The liquid restriction was not arbitrary. The state was concerned about vomiting during the execution. Their protocol specified no food for 10 hours before the procedure and no drink for 4 hours before. They did not want the condemned man to aspirate his own vomit while the nitrogen mask was strapped to his face. As the hours passed, the witnesses began to assemble. On one side were Smith's people. On the other side were the victim's sons, Mike and Chuck Sennett, who had waited 36 years for this day. At approximately 7 p.m., the witnesses were transported to Holman Correctional Facility. The drive took about 5 minutes. They were led to the viewing area adjacent to the execution chamber, separated from the condemned man by glass. They could see in, but they could not touch him or speak to him, except through that barrier. Inside the chamber, Kenneth Smith had already been strapped to the gurney. The nitrogen mask was positioned over his face, but not yet sealed. His arms were extended to the sides, giving him the appearance of a man on a cross. A white sheet covered his body up to his chest. The curtains separating the witnesses from the condemned man were about to open. What they would see over the next 22 minutes would challenge everything the state had promised about nitrogen hypoxia being quick and painless. Smith looked toward the witness area where his family sat. Despite the mask covering most of his face, he managed to smile at them. With his left hand, he signed the words, "I love you." It was a gesture his wife and sons would remember for the rest of their lives. Warden Terry Raybon stepped forward and read the death warrant. The formal words recited the authority of the state of Alabama to execute Kenneth Eugene Smith for the capital murder of Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett. The reading was a legal formality, the final official act before the killing began. Smith was given the opportunity to speak his final words. Through the mask, his voice was muffled, but the witnesses could make out what he said. "Tonight, Alabama caused humanity to take a step backward," he declared. "I'm leaving with love, peace, and light. Thank you for supporting me. Love all of you." He made a heart sign with his hand, a final gesture of love to the people who had stood by him. Then Reverend Hood spoke with him briefly and touched his feet with a Bible, providing what spiritual comfort was possible in those final moments. At approximately 7:56 or 7:57 p.m., 2 execution workers approached the mask. They closed the vent that allowed Smith to breathe normal air. The nitrogen began to flow. Kenneth Smith took his first breath of pure nitrogen gas, beginning the process that was supposed to render him unconscious within seconds. What happened next defied every assurance the state had made. For the next 4 minutes, from roughly 7:57 to 8:01 p.m., Smith began to convulse violently. His body popped up on the gurney over and over. He shook with such force that the entire gurney moved. His head jerked violently back and forth. Witnesses described him thrashing against the straps that held him down. His arms flailed despite the restraints, his fists clenched, his legs shook. He appeared to be heaving and retching inside the mask. Spit and mucus accumulated on the inside of the face covering, visible to everyone watching. The state had claimed he would lose consciousness within seconds. 4 minutes into the procedure, Kenneth Smith was clearly still awake and struggling. At approximately 8:02 p.m., about 5 to 6 minutes after the nitrogen began flowing, Kenneth Smith appeared to lose consciousness. The violent convulsions that had marked the first phase of the execution subsided. But death did not come quickly even then. For the next several minutes, Smith continued to breathe heavily. Witnesses described it as slightly gasping, with periodic labored breaths separated by long pauses. The pattern was consistent with what medical professionals call agonal breathing, the irregular gasps that often precede death. The nitrogen continued to flow through the mask. The state's protocol required a minimum of 15 minutes of gas flow or 5 minutes after the EKG showed a flatline, whichever came later. The execution team was following their procedures even as the witnesses watched in horror. At 8:07 p.m., a corrections officer approached Smith and examined him. This was approximately 10 minutes after the nitrogen began flowing. The officer was checking for signs of life, determining whether the execution was progressing as expected. At 8:08 p.m., all visible movement ceased. Kenneth Smith appeared to be dead, but the protocol required the gas to continue flowing, and the official pronouncement would not come for several more minutes. The witnesses sat in silence, watching a body that no longer showed any signs of life. At 8:15 p.m., the curtains were closed, blocking the witnesses' view of the chamber. 10 minutes later, at 8:25 p.m., Kenneth Eugene Smith was officially pronounced dead. The first nitrogen hypoxia execution in world history was complete. From the opening of the curtains to the official time of death, 32 minutes had elapsed. From the start of nitrogen flow to apparent death, approximately 15 minutes. From the start of nitrogen flow to the cessation of visible movement, about 11 minutes. None of these timelines matched the state's promises of unconsciousness within seconds. The media witnesses began to compose their accounts of what they had seen. Lee Hedgepeth, who had covered 5 executions in Alabama, said he had never seen such a violent reaction from a condemned inmate. This was the worst he had witnessed. Marty Roney reported that Smith appeared to convulse and shake vigorously for about 4 minutes after the nitrogen began flowing. Another 2 to 3 minutes passed before he appeared to lose consciousness, all while gasping for air to the extent that the gurney shook several times. Reverend Jeff Hood, who had been closest to Smith during the execution, was the most emphatic. What he witnessed, he said, was the most horrible thing he had ever seen. He called it 22 minutes of horror and described an unbelievable evil unleashed that night in Alabama. Kenneth Eugene Smith's life ended on January 25, 2024, but the questions raised by his execution continue to reverberate. He will be remembered not for the crime he committed in 1988, but for the manner in which the state of Alabama chose to kill him 36 years later. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. The story of Kenneth Eugene Smith raises questions that have no easy answers. Questions about justice, mercy, and the lengths a state will go to carry out a death sentence. Questions about what we owe to victims and what limits should exist on punishment. Questions about whether there is any truly humane way to take a human life. This was a No Way Out documentary. If you found this video informative and want to see more in-depth explorations of capital punishment cases, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support helps us continue telling these stories with the depth and accuracy they deserve. Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts on the Kenneth Smith case. Do you believe nitrogen hypoxia is a humane method of execution? Should judicial override have been abolished retroactively? We read every comment and appreciate hearing your perspectives. If you want to support the channel further, please like this video and share it with others who are interested in true crime and criminal justice issues. Every like, comment, and share helps this content reach more viewers. Thank you for being part of the No Way Out community. Until next time.